my timer?
That's right.
Yeah, thanks.
George, when we look at the resolution today, that is, Canada should legalize marijuana. It's going to be a very simple framework that we're going to weigh unmet benefits, and we're going to see which side provides the most good to the to Canadian society, and with an emphasis on understanding just how we work. Okay. Anyway, on to inherency. The first point under here is that despite the Liberal Party winning, and some people might think that marijuana legalization is inevitable, we think that that is not true, leading to our second point. That is the Conservatives. There is a lot of Conservatives within the Canadian Parliament, in the lower house and the upper house, the House of Commons and the Senate, who oppose this. And they have a majority in the Senate, and that's important because any bill to be passed through the Canadian Parliament will have to go through the House of Commons, then the Senate. Even if they call a joint session, they can't get it passed, and that's going to be important. The third is that the states or the provinces in Canada can't do it because exactly that, they're not states, they're provinces. And so that's something that's important. So at the end of the day, if we fiat away this inherency, we get to the plan. That is going to be Canadian Parliament will legalize marijuana. I repeat, Canadian Parliament will legalize marijuana. The time frame here is that we're going to pass the bill right away, but it will take about a year to take effect because of the laws and the legal and the tax framework around marijuana legalization, sale, all those things, standards that need to be set will take a year. We think that's realistic, that works very well. Before that, a question?
Yeah, can you, I don't mean to interrupt you if you're about to do it, but can you give some specifics on what exactly this legalization will look like in the day-to-day business aspect?
You can look at the Colorado model, you can look at the Amsterdam model. We have several models to assess, but essentially stores where people can go and buy if you're above a certain age, like how you sell any other regulated substance, perfectly fine. On to contention one. The A point under here has two subpoints. The first one is status quo decides what the state decides what happens to your own body. We think that's kind of messed up because it's like the state decides, oh, you can have alcohol, you can have cigarettes, but no marijuana, please. And that's important because the second point here is that this is an arbitrary line because it's proven time and time again that alcohol and cigarettes are much more harmful than marijuana. Cigarettes are the most addictive drug out there. Even over-the-counter drugs are abused, and even that marijuana is illegal and all these other drugs aren't. The B point under here is that plan lifts the ban on ganja. We see that when we do plan, we are going to lift the ban on marijuana, and that's going to be a positive thing, leading to point C, which is that in this instance, we're affirming our bodily autonomy. We can actually say, no, state. The state says, okay, we don't regulate your bodily autonomy in this specific case. We give you the right to choose what you want to do with it. So this leads to the D point, which is that the state still has the ability to regulate against third-party harm, but in the specific case of marijuana, there is no third-party harm. It's something like smoking a cigarette outside. It doesn't matter. This leads me to my impacts. There are going to be several. The first one is that we need to intrinsically protect bodily autonomy. This is how we protect against. This is how we protect against the threat. This is how we protect against the threat of majoritarianism. Because we have individuals and their rights being protected, that's always going to be a positive thing against protecting the rights of the people in general. We think that that's positive. We see that that's always going to be better because we should defer to a more criteria basing on bodily autonomy instead of utilitarianism, because that's always going to be positive with respect to understanding how our body functions and understanding that the state doesn't get to control it. Humans on their own accord will always do better decisions than the state, and that's always going to be a positive thing. On to contention two, that we're going to label this the gateway drug system. So the A point under here is that marijuana is not legal. This leads to all the second point under this is that this leads to black markets with marijuana in it and shady characters and gangs and cartels managing the flow of marijuana around the country. The B point under here is that plan changes this because now there are dispensaries that are legally selling marijuana. The C point under here has two subpoints. The first one is that this leads to you not interacting with shady people, interacting with gang members or interacting with criminals who would like you to get hooked on more addictive substances and thus give you bodily harm. The second is that pot can be laced. So illegally bought pot can be problematic for you because of the terrible substance it can contain. It can be more addictive, it can be cooked up, it can be very bad for you. And third is that the police now has to focus on these people selling marijuana instead of focusing on real hard criminals, and that's always going to be problematic because these people are being incarcerated and the police can't focus on heroin addiction or cocaine addiction. This is going to have several impacts. The first impact is about personal safety. We see that when you don't interact with gangs, I think that ensures your personal safety because a lot of times the criminals and the problematic elements of society do indulge in this sort of sale, and that's always going to be problematic. It's always safer to use dispensary material. And second one is about drug safety. If you're not using laced drugs, you're not getting addicted to harder drugs. This happens several times where people will use marijuana, but the marijuana is laced with something more sinister, and that always leads to more terrible things. The third advantage is going to be economics. You can cross-apply my links, my uniqueness and a link on this onto the economic from the second advantage. But here the C part is going to be that there are nearly 13 million people using marijuana in Canada today, and that's a lot of money. Second thing is that the second one in C is that Colorado will raise $1 billion in taxes this year, and that's a lot of money. We think that this leads us into our D point, which is that all this money can go to amazing things within Canada, leading to a betterment of lifestyle in general. So the first point is education. We can have so much money and put in education. Quality education is going to be key for the future. It's going to be a great impact in the long term. We see that infrastructure is also important. In a developed society, it's important to focus on crumbling infrastructure, always make it better to compete with the world, always get more investment from outside, build more industry. That's always going to be positive for the people since they're getting jobs. And third is going to be social security. Canada has a very robust system of social security, but as other aging populations, they run a risk of defunding it and dissolve.
All right, Judge ready? And go. Good, again. I'd like to first start off with a round of thanks to everyone around, the government team, as well as Judge for taking time out of your day, and my partner. I'm going to be first looking over an inherency argument and then 3 disadvantages. I agree with the framework they presented for this resolution, net benefits, policy round. And I think what's really key is that they have failed to prove the inherency of the case. So that's going to be my main argumentation this round. But one inherency point with numerous subpoints is that legalization is impending. Legalization is impending. The first subpoint is that of the status quo. Right now, the status quo, Trudeau, the new Prime Minister of Canada, his party has been elected to a majority in both the Parliament and in the Senate. The status quo is that this party has promised to legalize marijuana. So what we have is the party promising to legalize marijuana, which means marijuana legalization is impending. My second point is that of no barrier. There's no barrier in 2 distinct ways. The first way is that of political. My opponents mentioned the conservatives in the Senate and the Parliament and saying that they would oppose it. This is not actually true. Conservatives in the Parliament and the Senate have said that they're willing to negotiate over marijuana legalization. The specific word for this is that they won't block it because they have other policy goals. The Conservatives have an agenda inside of Canada, specifically economic, more laissez-faire, increasing free trade agreements, as well as other goals, less military intervention by the Canadians. And so they have other goals that they believe are more important, and so they're willing to negotiate over those goals and are willing to let marijuana legalization happen. The second way that there's no barrier is that of 80% popular support, 80% of Canadians support legalization of marijuana. The C point is that it's a top priority. Trudeau has stated that they would get started on it right away. It is a top priority of the party that is now the majority in the Canadian government. The D point is that of timeline fairness. What we have is no timeline fairness from the government team because they're basically implementing the status quo. Simply because they're implementing it slightly earlier, which in fact they actually aren't because they're implementing it over a 1-year period, which is likely what's going to happen in the status quo. So there's no actual difference between the government team's plan as well as the status quo. So basically we have 2 teams in this round defending what the opposition is supposed to be defending. There are impacts to this, two impacts. The first impact is that of negative ground. We have no ground in this debate round. There is no argumentation that the opposition can make because the government team has presented the opposition case already, the status quo. The second impact is that of a new affirmative burden. I think we should have a debate round anyway, but the debate round should take place on a new affirmative burden, and that is they should go further. They need to go further than the plan by Trudeau. And I think that the award for this is clear in their own rhetoric that they gave in their case. They talked about how we should have a plan more like Colorado, where basically any store can sell pot on any street corner. Trudeau's plan is more conservative, more regulated access to pot, a more regulated system of marijuana legalization. So what the affirmative team must do is they must argue for a less regulated legalization system and a more open access to marijuana in Canada versus the plan by Trudeau. So this is the new burden for the affirmative team that they have to argue for. And I'll be presenting three disadvantages for why we believe this is inferior to Trudeau's plan and the legalization that is going to happen in the status quo. The first disadvantage is that of underage use. And I have several subpoints. The first point is that of unregulated access. If we have less regulation and if we have more stores that are willing to offer access to marijuana, then we have more unregulated access to this drug. The viewpoint is that of ability to obtain. Unregulated access, even if there are age constraints, increases the ability of minors to gain access to this to the drug. We can see this with access to alcohol. In states that have much more access to alcohol, states that don't restrict where individuals can purchase it, have much more problems with minor abuse of alcohol than states that don't. So this is a major problem of underage use that is linked directly to lack of regulation and increased access to marijuana. This has two impacts, both of which affect youth or harm youth. The first impact is that of education. Increased access to drugs, especially marijuana, impacts education of youth. By spending more time recreationally smoking, or they focus less on their education and hurt themselves in the long run. The second impact is that of employment. Employers are much less likely to employ someone who's addicted to marijuana or has marijuana in their blood, which it can remain in your blood if you use it, and in your hair, other drug tests, for months after you've last used it. So this can definitely harm their employment opportunities, which can hurt the youth inside of Canada. The second disadvantage is that it's unsafe. The 8th point is that regulation is necessary. Regulation is necessary for ensuring the safety of drugs or access to marijuana. And I think this is linked especially to the analysis that the government team gave in their, I believe it's their second contention, that is a gateway drug. They talked about the problems of drugs in the black market and how it can be impure, how additives can be added to make it more addictive. And so there are problems with unsafe drugs. Now, yes, it will be made more safe by legalization, but it will be made even more safe if we have regulations for the production and the sale of marijuana. Without these regulations, which is what the government would have to advocate, we have no regulation and therefore health risks, which is my second point. Health risks from impure marijuana, health risks from individuals who don't have to go through legal processes for producing it, legal processes or maybe standards or testing by the Canadian Drug Enforcement Agency to make sure that it's pure and doesn't have other additives inside of it. The impact to this is that of medical overload. What we currently have is problems with the Canadian system. The Canadian medical system, as a state-run system, already has a larger amount of patients than they can cope with. So this bill, increasing or continuing the problem that Canada's medical system has, will tip, or at least make the problem, won't make the problem better, and will make it worse. Status quo, where we have regulation, will improve the system and help Canada's medical system overcome the problems they currently have. The third disadvantage is that of revenue lost. The 8th point is the status quo, and that is that of gained revenue. And I think this is clear from the rhetoric of the government team that legalizing marijuana definitely does increase revenue for the government. The B point is that of tax evasion. Lacking regulation or a more regulated market where the government has access to the data as well as the sellers and that type of thing can lead to tax evasion. Individuals can, because they don't have to maybe report sales of production or report sales as well as production, or have the ability to evade taxes on marijuana. The B point is that it undermines the revenue. By having tax evasion, we have a decrease of revenue that we could gain from medical marijuana, or not just medical, but recreational marijuana as well. So the C point is that it undermines social welfare, and here you can cross-apply the analysis of the government team as well. That Canada's social welfare system depends largely on tax revenue, and so undermining tax revenue would hurt social welfare inside of Canada. The impact of this is that Canadians are harmed. Many Canadians rely on the social welfare system inside of Canada, and so reducing revenue to these systems would hurt Canadians as a whole and reduce the benefit that would be gained from a status quo plan. Looking at their own case, we once again disagree with their inherency argumentation, and we agree with their contentions that basically this is the status quo. That what we have is no debate, and then from that no debate, we can have a debate over how marijuana should be legalized. Marijuana is going to be legalized, 100% certainty. We will have legalized marijuana. The question is, should we legalize marijuana with a heavy regulated system or no regulations? And we believe that we should have regulations for the safety of the Canadian people who are interested in using marijuana, as well as for the good of Canadians as a whole for the tax revenue from marijuana. Thank you.
It's going to be on and off.
Ready?
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Starting off on the on case, just briefly before I address the inherency point, you can flow through all of our advantages. Like, they don't touch that; they grant us all of that. So the only real issue in this round today is the inherency argument, because all of their disadvantages link only to this notion of this new affirmative burden. They've constructed the entirety of the negative position on the assumption that we agree with their definition of a new affirmative burden, which we don't. But before that, let's start at the top of their inherency argument. They say that, that in the status quo, the Liberal Party is the majority in the Parliament and the Senate. That's not true. What we see right now is that these elections take place at different times. We see that in the Senate, the Conservatives still have a majority because the elections for the Senate happen at a different time. So while the Liberal Party got elected to the executive branch, and while the Liberals have a small majority in the House itself, they don't enjoy a majority in the Senate, where the Conservatives still have the majority in the Senate. This is going to be key later on. The second here is they talk about how there's no barriers. And the one point underneath this is that, they say there's no political barrier because Conservatives are willing to negotiate on this. Specifically, here's where the argumentation becomes problematic. Specifically, one, we see that the Conservatives right now have suffered a major loss, right? They've lost control of the House and they lost control of the executive branch. So specifically, the Conservatives are going to need to retain whatever strength they can, which means that the last stronghold they hold is in the Senate. So what we see here is that the Conservatives have to rally support. They have to rally support from voters. What's going to happen here is that the Conservatives want to maintain support, and so they're going to have to check back against this liberal agenda. Specifically, their argumentation is that the Conservatives are willing to negotiate on marijuana, but we see that that's not going to be the case because, one, that's going to show that they're conceding on this agenda, and two, specifically, the articulation here is that the Conservatives are willing to negotiate on the legalization of marijuana for medical purposes. The Conservatives are not willing to negotiate on legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes. That's going to be really problematic for their timeline fairness argumentation. And two, the second issue here is the 80% popular support. We see that the popular support in Canada is for medical marijuana legalization for the benefits of cancer research, depression research, etc., PTSD research. There's a lot of research that shows that that marijuana is beneficial for a medical reason. But we see that the Conservatives still have a foothold in Canada, in that it's much more problematic based on legalization for purely recreational purposes. And as a result, Plan is an advocation of legalization for both recreational and medical purposes, which is why the Conservatives are going to oppose this. Your question?
Can't Conservatives rally support by supporting a very popular policy change?
But the thing is, that's not responsive, right? The issue here, I've articulated why the Conservatives have to oppose this, and specifically why they're opposing this on an ideological and a political reason. They're opposing this on recreational use, and they're also opposing this on party lines, specifically because they're fine with negotiating for medical purposes because the logic is there. But they want to check back against the liberal agenda. They aren't willing to negotiate on a recreational use. On the issue of top priority, specifically, we see here that it doesn't matter if it's a top priority for the Liberals because the Conservatives still hold a majority in the Senate. That means they're always going to be checked back. That means it's never going to go through if they're trying to legalize it for both recreational and medical use. So it doesn't matter if it's top priority. On the issue of timeline fairness, they say that we're just implementing the status quo. We're saying no, we've articulated reasons as to why that, like, this isn't going to happen in the status quo, and that's why we need to use fiat to make this happen, right? We specifically talk about how, like, the conservatives are going to oppose it, and specifically on the difference between medical and recreational use, and that differential is why the conservatives oppose this. On the issue of how they have no negative ground, we see that this is fundamentally not true, right? The negative ground here is that Canada should not legalize marijuana. That's all. Like they reject that negative ground in favor of trying to skew the debate, right? They're trying to take away the affirmative ground, which is Canada should legalize marijuana. They're trying to say that no, the affirmative ground of Canada should legalize marijuana is negative ground, and the affirmative has to argue for this hyper-specific position of the affirmative should support a system in which marijuana is legalized and then not regulated They're actually taking away our ground and trying to force us to argue from an uphill position that we can never win. So what we see here is that this argumentation of no negative ground is fundamentally, one, not true, and two, this is abusive to the government side, specifically because it pigeonholes us into a position that we can't possibly ever solve for and that we can't ever win. Specifically, they reject the ground that exists in the debate today. They could have argued that Canada should not legalize marijuana on like an ethical stance, on like a value stance. They could have talked about how like the implementation of this policy trades off with other politics that Canada needs to look at now. Instead, they just simply accept that legalization is going to happen. They support the government side and say the government should go super liberal, super ridiculous, and talk about how marijuana should be legalized without regulation. Finally, they say the new act burden is going further. We show you why this isn't the case. And two, they specifically say we should adopt the Colorado model and say that we have to advocate for that. But we see in Colorado that isn't the case, right? What happens in Colorado is you can't just sell marijuana in any store corner, right? Colorado specifically says that in order for a store to sell marijuana, they have to apply for a dispensary permit, which in and of itself is regulation. So even if they say that the government has to advocate for the Colorado model, that means all of their argumentation on like unregulated access goes away because the Colorado model requires these dispensaries to have a permit in order to sell marijuana. Like all of this is just, even if you want to accept their idea of a new affirmative burden, that means the new affirmative burden of the Colorado model doesn't link to any of the disadvantages, which means you're always going to be voting for the government on a cost-benefit analysis because there's just no disadvantages, regardless of if you have the regular view of affirmative burden or if you take their view of affirmative burden. Like there's just no disadvantages to plan in either scenario. And like going on to the disadvantages real quick, specifically like all of their links are unregulated access, lack of regulation, regulation good, and loss of revenue because we don't regulate. All of their articulations on the disadvantages are based upon this issue of regulation. We show you why, one, that's not the case and shouldn't be the case in this debate, and two, even if you accept their implementation of a new affirmative burden, and they specifically cite the Colorado model. They don't say any other model, right? Even in the Colorado model, we see that there is no lack of regulation, which means that their idea of underage use doesn't happen. Their idea of how it's unsafe also doesn't happen, and their issue of lost revenue doesn't exist, which means at the end of the day, they, one, don't take their negative ground, two, try to skew the affirmative out of our ground, three, even if you accept their interpretation of what this debate should be, we as the affirmative show you why on a cost-benefit framework, you're always going to be voting for the government because the disadvantages never link to the plan in either instance, and regardless of the inherency debate, we've shown you articulated reasons why the conservatives are going to go against this, why there is inherency, and why we have to use fiat to get access to the plan and thus the advantages. That's why you're going to be voting for the government.
Government? Excellent. Quick thanks to opposition, judge, and my opponent. Order is just going to be, I'm going to tag it, but it's going to be on and then off, and a little bit of analysis of burdens at the end. So starting off with inherency, obviously this is where a majority of the round centers around, whether or not it's actually happening right now, and then like, what I want to emphasize though is that clearly the law is not today, right now, this minute in place. But the idea here is there's a timeline of fairness. There's a certain threshold that once this president, who has an overwhelming 80% popular support, and who has said this policy is his #1 priority, is going to implement this, there's a certain logical, reasonable barrier in debate where this policy is essentially inherent, where there's 100% certainty that this will happen, and all of the government's argumentation is invalid. Starting off with inherency, the first point under this is the political barrier. Under the Senate and the President's party and the political barrier. His first response was not right now. They don't have a majority, or the Liberals don't have a majority in the Senate right now. And he said the Conservatives need to regroup and they're going to oppose this bill. I have three responses. First, there is no block for this bill from the Conservatives. Why? Because they have an alternative. Well, there's two reasons. First is alternative agenda. They have alternative agendas, economic agendas, as well as military-based agendas that they want to be passed. And so they're not going to sacrifice all of that for this one bill. Second reason is the government's own argumentation. They're weak right now because of political backlash on their alternative agendas, and because they don't want to oppose something that has 80% popular support. They're not going to weaken their already crumbling party by saying, oh yeah, we're going to block this bill that literally everyone in the government and the country wants to support, or at least 8% of the country and the current newly elected party. My second response is actually majority in the Senate. The Conservatives have majority in Parliament, but right now the Senate, as well as the President's office, are both controlled by the Liberals. So this policy will pass anyway. There's not going to be any block by the Conservatives because they have no reason to for self-interest. And even if they did block it, they couldn't because they don't have a majority in the Senate, as well as the President is liberal. Sure.
When was the last time a president or prime minister kept his policy, like, manifesto? Like, when was the last time it was like, we'll do this, and they did it immediately? Like Guantanamo Bay and Obama?
Sure. So the president was just elected 3 days ago. And yeah, Guantanamo and Obama, that's funny. But the president was just elected 3 days ago. So obviously by lunchtime, he's not going to implement this policy. The curious thing, though, is that the government team operates off of the exact same timeline that the president is probably going to operate off of. If they pass it today, they say it's still going to take a year to become an actual law and be implemented in full. That's the exact same timeline we can expect from any policy. Even the most efficient governments don't pass laws tomorrow, so that's an unreasonable barrier, although I accept your POI. So yeah, they have no reason to block, and even if they could, that's suicide for them. The next point is under the top priority for, under popular support. He said only medical support. Patently false. Two responses. First is patently false. They support complete legalization. Second response is the proof for that. Why? Because we saw the recent president elected by a landslide, and 80% of the population support him and this policy. So some of them support medical, sure, but 80% support complete legalization. Point C, top priority for Trudeau. They said it doesn't matter. Yes, it does, because he's the majority. He can do literally whatever he wants, and he said this is his top priority. Just because he was elected on a landslide, or because he was elected on a landslide, doesn't mean he wants to all of a sudden lose all that popular support and abandon his campaign promises, although it does happen somewhat commonly, but for him, it's not going to happen. He has the Senate in his favor. D is timeline fairness. They said, no, we need fiat. Two responses for this. One, it's like arguing Colorado. Basically, the government team is arguing, let's legalize marijuana in Colorado because it's already happening. Everything is in place. Everything is set. There's literally no barrier. This is an inherent policy. There's 100% certainty that will happen. Second response is timeline is the same as the status quo also. So not only is there no barrier, it's like arguing Colorado legalization, but secondly, the timeline is the exact same. I already mentioned this in previous arguments. Their timeline is the same as the status quo anyway. The final point is under the impacts. They said of negative ground. They said, well, we do have ground. Two responses. First, even if we did have ground, they completely rejected my partner's alternative. He said, hey, this policy is completely inherent, so let's argue about the details of the plan, how much regulation we should have. They completely rejected that whatsoever, taking away all the ground that we presented. Second, no ground because the Gov supports the status quo. So there is no ground anyway, and the ground that we suggested, they completely rejected. Maybe not the issue of all of their advantages. They said flow all those through because they're accepted. Of course they're accepted, because they're going to happen under the status quo. We're biting each of their advantages because on the same timeline, through the same government without any barriers, in the same fashion, this policy is going to be implemented. So all of their advantages are actually opposition advantages winning us the round. Now moving down to the alternative burden, well actually, quickly I want to address our three disadvantages. This debate should be about what type of legalization we should implement rather than whether or not to legalize, and they completely rejected that alternative, taking away all of our ground. This should not be an inherency debate. Everyone hates inherency debates, but they've made this an inherency debate because they're arguing for the status quo. Now moving down to the alternative burden issue, I have a couple responses because they argue on its legitimacy, its practicality, and how now actually we're stealing ground from them. 4 responses. First, it's not ridiculous because it's literally filled with nuances. The regulation for what marijuana should look like has limitless nuances for how the policy should be implemented, formed, etc. And that gives us so much more ground to debate rather than arguing for whether the status quo should be the status quo or not. Second, Colorado has minimal, almost no regulation. So that, I mean, their own plan argued for whether, they mentioned Denver or Amsterdam and Colorado. And Colorado has almost no regulation. They argued for the dispensary licenses, which are phenomenally easy to get, almost as easy as becoming an Uber driver. And so we can argue like what type of regulation, whether that's a good model or a bad model. but they rejected all of that, which is actually my third response under the alternative burden. They rejected the whole discussion and a whole alternative debate by saying, I mean, they didn't even put any ink on any of the 3 disadvantages. They rejected this whole alternative debate. My fourth response is Canada is regulated to ensure safety. That's definitely debatable. The impacts are weighable. We can weigh the impacts of alternative regulation, as well as it provides more ground for the entire debate. I mean, that's basically a theme throughout all 4 of these responses. At the end of the day, what we see is my partners try to present us with an alternative of rather than debating an impossible, uneducated fact round of whether or not the status quo should be the status quo or not. I mean, it's not even that debatable. He's saying, let's debate about what type of regulation Canada should impose. They rejected that entire debate, and even all of their responses under whether it's inherent or not don't stand, because there is no political barrier, no popular barrier, no legislative barrier, and there's literally no barrier for this happening, and the timeline of fairness wins us the round also. There's no ground. They rejected the app burden. For that reason, you should vote opposition. Thank you.
All right, is everyone ready? Let's begin. I'd like to extend a final round of thanks to everyone in this round. I'm going to be going over 3 voting issues showing exactly why I believe an opposition ballot is warranted in this round. The first voting issue is that legalization is the status quo. Legalization is the status quo. I have several subpoints under this. The first subpoint is that affirmative warrants are insufficient. Affirmative warrants are insufficient. Basically, the only warrants they've given you for why it is not inherent is that, well, the Conservatives are going to irrationally oppose this in the face of electoral defeat. The Conservatives have lost elections inside of Canada because they oppose, in part, legalizing marijuana. Basically, that is their only warrant. Well, their second one is that, well, Trudeau's lying and he's not going to pass this, he's not going to keep his campaign promises. I think that these are very weak warrants. Versus my second subpoint, which is opposition warrants are stronger. Opposition warrants are stronger. We've given you several reasons why we believe Conservatives will not irrationally oppose this, but will in fact support it. Because they have an alternative agenda that they want to negotiate over, that they're willing to legalize marijuana in order to get these goals passed. And secondly, that they're weak right now. They've lost elections by opposing a very popularly supported position. And so they're obviously going to get in line with it and support it, get some deals on the side to strengthen their position, but they're going to do that in order to strengthen their electoral position. I think this is fairly obvious. And to deny this is to deny political realities. The further warrants we have is that it's extremely likely, in fact, we can basically guarantee that Trudeau is going to keep his campaign promise on this. Yes, politicians are notorious liars, but in Canada, they're much less so than in the United States. Canadian politicians typically keep their campaign promises. We've seen in the last administration where they decreased regulation in their economy and increased economic growth as they promised that they would do. They've kept their promise to implement state-provided health care. So we see Canadians definitely implementing campaign promises on a major scale. And to simply assume that they're not going to pass it when they've stated over and over again that they are, when they're backed by popular support, when everything points to the conclusion that they are going to pass it, is simply to grasp at straws in denying what's actually going to happen. My C point is that of no ground. Once again, this gives us no ground as the negative team. Basically, they're saying, well, they could argue against legalization of marijuana and say it's bad, but that's saying that we have to argue against the status quo. The status quo is legalization of marijuana. The negative ground, the opposition ground, is the status quo, and they're taking the status quo away from us. The fourth point is that of a fair alternative. We're not trying to pigeonhole them into some bad alternative. What we're saying is less regulation or more regulation, a heavily regulated state or less regulated. We're not saying that they have to support a position of no regulation at all, but simply one where there's lighter regulation like in Colorado, which is extremely fair alternative, and they provided no third alternative. They're simply saying deny all of us all of our negative ground or reject this what we think of unfair alternative, when in fact it is fair. So legalization is the status quo, which leads me to my second voting issue, which is the advantages of the status quo. Yes, we accept their 3 contentions, the advantages of legalizing marijuana, because that is the status quo, and that is what we're defending. So there are clear advantages, clear net benefits in this round of supporting an opposition ballot. My final voting issue is the disadvantages of the plan. The disadvantages of the plan. I'd like to point out that all of my analysis under these points was dropped. There was no response except on the link point, which in fact does link into their plan. If we look at a support for a lighter regulation like in Colorado, we see the problem starting to occur. Underage use of marijuana is increasing in Colorado. We see tax evasion. So what we see are clear problems attributable to less regulation. And these problems, my analysis between less regulation and these problems has gone unrefuted. So in face of that lack of refutation, these disadvantages stand. There will be regulation under a government ballot, light regulation, but the regulation won't stop the problems. And the problems are sufficient enough on a net benefit scale to outweigh the advantages of voting government. So an opposition ballot is warranted because we get the benefits without the lack of regulation that cause the problems. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Judge, we're going to have 3 voters today. The first one is going to, before I go into any of that, extend my partner's argumentation about medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. There is a difference. We have seen time and time again, this is not, they claim that this is patently false, and because Justin Trudeau won in a landslide, but it's clear, it's a majority vote. Even if he won in a landslide, it's not, that does not mean they support his particular policy. This is about, the Conservatives are willing to negotiate on medical marijuana, not recreational marijuana. Them claiming it's just patently false is not true, because they just because they claim it's patently false, it does not make the fact that this is what is status quo. They say we are okay with medical marijuana because there is some merit to that, but recreational marijuana, we are going to oppose it. So their only warrants on how this is patently false was how Trudeau won a landslide, but we see that every time a parliament, the way a parliamentary system works is when you have elections and constituencies, if your constituencies have a lot of members, only the one with a 1% extra wins, and so it's a lot of times the people does not exactly mean how parties and how legislative structures are shaped. So that's something that you ought to consider there. On the idea of Conservatives rallying behind their own base, we see that if we have shown you today that there is a difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, and how the Conservatives are okay with medical marijuana. They are going to try to protect their base by talking about recreational marijuana as opposed to talking about medical marijuana as opposed to supporting recreational marijuana. This is something that goes unaddressed in their side, and that is important. Extend the argument that they have a majority in the Senate. So at the end of the day, they do get a say on this. So even if Trudeau is strong-willed and fiery-willed, if they have a say in the negotiation, we think that the inherent seeker just drops out. On the issue of regulation, Judge, they say that, oh, Colorado is not really regulated, it's very easy. But my partner showed you there is a system of legality. We think that they're smarter than us to say that if the Colorado system made this particular system of giving out licenses, we think that you have to use that. And you say that we say that the disadvantages are also linking into this no regulation, because if their model is the Colorado model, that also links into the disadvantages, and that's something that's important here. Getting on to resolutionality and on the issue of how this round shaped. The resolution, the burden the affirmative had to affirm the sentence that Canada should legalize marijuana. We did exactly that, Judge. We don't. The thing of the matter is that the regulation is a latter step. If we did that, then you would have called us out on extra T, and that doesn't make sense, because our job is to be resolutional, and we have been perfectly resolutional in this round, and the burden is on them to say that why the resolution isn't correct, and why maybe we should not legalize, because in the status quo it isn't legal. And so if the idea is for them to defend status quo, they can defend status quo. But the fact of the matter is we are winning inherency at the end of the day based on the difference between the Conservatives supporting medical marijuana and not recreational marijuana. That goes unaddressed. They say that, oh, well, they want to concede on some other things. But that doesn't matter because of our second voter, which is going to be that they want to rally their base around the opposition to liberal agenda of recreational use of marijuana. And that's important, Judge. And at the end of the day, if you are to weigh the impacts on both sides, we see that we have an ethical claim on maximizing autonomy to the people without stopping harm, and that's something that's going to be important in this round, because we think that through this step, this is a step in the right direction, and despite an unfair burden being put on us, which we think that's pretty unfair. and it's kind of abusive because at the end of the day, that pigeonholes us into a small space. We think that taking a good policy decision, increasing autonomy to the Canadian people is always going to be a positive step. With that in mind, Judge, you should be voting for the government.